Hello, Middle Earth Strategy Battle Gamers and LTR SBG Team fans. We're here with the second episode of our battle class, which is going to be an in-depth kind of catalog of videos that goes more into, I guess, skills and different skills and techniques and tactics and in-depth thought for Middle Earth Strategy Battle game. So this is season one, how a game plays out, and in this episode we will be focusing on deployment. So I think okay, so I'm going to take the lead in here. We have all of our instructors, Jason, Joe, Sam, Rainier, and Derek, and myself. And with deployment, I think a new player can make some mistake of looking at deployment as just uh, a quick um, a quick process. But a good player, or let me rephrase this: deployment is, I would say, probably one of the second most important things in a game, besides movement. Or maybe even you could argue deployment is the most important thing in the game, because generally, someone's deployment, you can tell when that deployment is done. Sometimes you can tell if you're going to win or lose the game, and part of that is, and when you're viewing your opponent's deployment, you can see if they are a really good player or if they're new. So, what are things to look for in deployment? So, I don't want to take all the content away from my peers, so I'm going to list one thing I think is one thing to look for deployment, and that would be terrain. So terrain can really make or break your deployment. So one thing I like to look for on a board is um, line of sight blockers, hills, woods, bottlenecks, just different things I can use to mitigate my opponent's ability to move towards an objective or move in general. So I really like to position myself in my deployment to um, use those areas of terrain to my advantage. Another thing is with deployment is if your opponent has a very heavy shooting force, you can mitigate some of those shots using trees, woods, um, fences, buildings. So having a good deployment can save you at the beginning of the game and possibly even win you the game. Thoughts?
I agree. I've had several because the army I play most is a low model count kind of skirmish army. So when I'm deploying, I want to look for places where my opponent won't be able to mob me, but at the same time, I can utilize um, the strengths of my army to move around on the board. So yeah, deployment is very key, especially on scenarios where you can deploy on like a certain board edge, like Maelstrom and things. Those are different kind of beasts, but uh, like Lords of Battle or Domination, where you could deploy in your deployment zone, whereas there's a set deployment zone. I've learned that deploying my army, like a low model army, it's really key. You gotta look at places on the board where you can move faster or get to a place first, or that kind of thing. So yeah, I think deployment, it could win you the game, could also lose you the game. Sam, what are your thoughts?
Um, for me, I'm a very conservative player. Even though I have dwarves with their, really meaty defenses, um, I really like to use insight in my favors if all possible. I ask myself a lot of questions. What is with my opponent's current deployment? Say I'm not finished deploying, and they have stuff on the field. Where could they take what they have currently on the board? Could they go over here and um, cause me to be in a pinch in this spot? Could they rally together here, or could they exploit me in some way based on their current deployment, not just using my deployment, but what the opponent has going for them, assuming you're alternating. I look at where my army can go. I only have movement of 5 inches most of the time, and that's a big factor. I can't just rush across the board, so I gotta maximize. It's the weakness for the dwarves, I'd say, and I have to play with that weakness in mind. And I think knowing your army is a really important part of deployment. Say you have a heavy cavalry army, you definitely don't want to get in a small bottleneck kind of area, because you want to be able to fit models through to get on other models in combat. Otherwise, your cavalry models are going to be outnumbered in a bottleneck. I have learned from experience many times to keep your army together. I've seen it happen to my side and to my opponent's side, where they have a lone warband off to the side somewhere, and it just get creamed by a fairly large force because there was no backup. They didn't have the power to take on what came their way. And so I've learned there's strength in numbers. When you have your whole army together, whatever comes your way, whether it be the entire other army of your enemy or just one warband, you'll be more prepared. I actually like to kind of move along terrain. If there's large open lanes, I actually try not to take those, even if typically if my opponent has magic or archery, I typically avoid just being out in the open in general. Despite my short movement, and my defense, I don't want to get shot at. Like I said, I'm a conservative player. It's really saved me a lot in the past, because you never quite know what the roll of the dice is going to be when you do get in combat, and you want to make sure you have as many guys in combat as you can. So that's my greatest tool, is just using insight, asking questions, looking at possible scenarios of what could happen. Where could your opponent go? Where could you go? And optimizing your odds for when you do roll the dice. What are your thoughts, Jason?
So I'm gonna jump with a small story real quick. I get asked all the time what this game is. What is this game like? And the easiest way I describe it is chess on steroids. Well, chess, your deployment, so to speak, is already set for you. So for this game, deployment's not set, and I'll piggyback off of what Dan said. I personally think deployment is one of your most important spots. I think Dan and Joe both said it's really, you can win or lose based on your deployment. There's some scenarios you can't really set your deployment, but there are others where you can. And I'll be honest, I still make mistakes deploying, and even though I've been playing for a little bit now, you're never going to be perfect. We're all humans. We all make mistakes, but you can definitely learn from those mistakes. So if you play a game and you look back, darn, I wish I had deployed myself this way instead of that way. Hey, you just learn from that. You'll learn more in defeat than you will in victory. So I like what you said, Sam. Definitely deploy together. If you've got one of those shield wall type armies now, you definitely want to keep that shield wall bonus together. Dan runs it a lot now with his ministerial. The warriors get shield wall through base contact with 3, and there's a number of the armies that have that. So if you have models like that, you want to deploy those together. You want to get that bonus. That way, in some scenarios where you're deployed apart and your opponent has shooting, you want to be able to have that higher defense to try and mitigate their shooting a little bit. Again, bottlenecks, really smart, especially with Cav. We'll talk about movement later, but when you're starting out, you don't want to pull yourself in a position where if you have cavalry, you're going to put yourself in a bottleneck where you can get outnumbered, like Sam said. That's really bad. And you'll watch your more expensive models walk off the field real fast because they just get outdiced. Buildings, I think Dan mentioned that as well. Watch for archery. Use that as cover. When you deploy yourself, think of it. If you're facing elves with their strength 3 bows, or even crossbows now, we're seeing more of, especially with Iron Hills and even Urukai crossbows. Try and position yourself so that crossbows can't move and shoot. So your opponent's probably gonna try and set themselves up to be able to get their shot off on their first turn. So steal that away from them. You're gonna know what your opponent has because most good opponents will show you their army list beforehand or tell you what they're playing. That's just what do you call it? Nice common decency, I guess, of how the game flows. So you can steal some of those shots from your opponent by deploying yourself with some cover from trees, from buildings, and even your own shooting. If you're on a side where you have dedicated archers, you don't want to leave your archers alone. But if it's a scenario that you can do it, you can always deploy them up in a building if they're on your side. So I think that's pretty much all for me. Not much. The biggest thing I'm going to piggyback on again is you're going to make mistakes. Deployment is it's the start. You're going to make a mistake. Uh, Learn from it. That's all. Thoughts, guys?
Yeah, yeah. I would like to piggyback off something that Sam said that I thought was a really good point. So when you're deploying your army, don't forget that your opponent is also deploying their army. Depending on the turn sequence, like who's deploying first. And I think that a big mistake I see is, and this is for all you new players and players who've been playing a while but maybe want to improve your deployment. A lot of people deploy their big warband or archers first. Okay, so that allows your opponent to then counter deploy either away from that hero or deploy in a way where you don't have any shots. And so, one thing I look out for when I'm versing somebody is I look for their shooting, I look for their big heroes, and I try to then counter and deploy in a way where they're going to have to either shoot past their own guys, which good armies can't do, or um, deploy just totally out of line of sight and make them have to then move towards me, and then that's a couple of turns where they're not shooting at me. Another thing I like to do when my opponent is deploying is look at their war bands and start to piece together what warband I want to attack and where I can actually win the fights and go for a burnout. Thoughts?
Yeah, I actually would like to mention something that I don't think has been mentioned yet. So in the scenario like Lords of Battle, where both you and your opponent can deploy on the center of the line, and basically, if you and your opponent do that, then that means you can engage in the combats in the first turn of the game. What I like to say though is when you deploy something like that, then make sure that when you deploy, you don't put it where your big pieces, like for instance, a mounted Boromir or Dane Ironfoot or Aemir or the Witch King. Well, the Witch King on horse, where they can't move past your shield wall to get into fights. I've seen this before, actually quite a bit, and I've done it myself. Is you deploy you and your opponent deploy on the center of the line, so you're going to start fighting right off the bat. But then you put out of instinct, you put your big piece behind your shield wall or behind your army, so you can have free movement to charge them or to move them, so that way they don't get based first. And I've seen it before where you do that, but then you inadvertently pin your guys behind your line because sometimes you can't move around a obstruction to get to the enemy. So in a way, you just did yourself a disservice. So when you're deploying, I would say if you're deploying like that, if you and your opponent are both gonna duke it out in the first turns of the game, then I would say make sure you have a plan to get your heroes and make sure your big piece, not even just heroes, big pieces like a cave troll or an ent, where they can be able to maneuver around and get into base contact as well. So that way you don't waste the points or do yourself a disservice. So, Sam, you got any thoughts on any of this?
Um, yeah, I definitely got to agree with you on the putting heroes at the back of your line, and that's happened to me far too often, where my heroes just couldn't get into combat because they couldn't get through, and I've made an extra effort to put them more at the side of my warband, maybe at the back side of the warband, so they can just go around the side really fast if they need to. But that way, I can get them in combat especially if they're a combat heavy hero. Because it's always good. You want to be able to make sure you can use, your might if you really need to, so you can win the game. Thoughts?
I've got one off of going back to what Dan was saying at the beginning. You really got to be tactical with what you deploy first. If your opponent, personally, I like to go second when we deploy. I don't like to deploy first because I like to see what my opponent's going to throw down, and especially since I usually have fewer war bands, and a lot of folks play with smaller war bands, and they have more drops, as we call them. The ability to put more war bands down so they can see where you're going to be at. So I like to go second. But you got to be careful when you go first, because you can make a mistake where I actually just did this recently in a battle against Joe. I deployed all my I deployed all my I'm sorry all my cavalry first, and since Joe saw that, he was able to deploy away from them, which ended up hurting me and causing me to have to play different, and ultimately cost me the game because he saw where my cavalry was. I was using a chariot, which is big, and he deployed away from it. So that took away that what should have been a big movement piece for me and a big part of the strategy against my opponent. And you got to be careful with your deployment. I like to try and deploy a smaller warband first. That way, you can get your opponent to deploy one out, and then just go from there. And then, like I think everybody said it now, protecting your heroes. Yeah, you got to build a shield wall, but you definitely have to leave an alleyway. For the Lords of Battle scenario, since we're talking about it, I actually like to try and deploy back a little bit so that I'm not just meat grinding in the very first turn. That way, I can see how my opponent is going to set up their army and what maybe they're going to get. Because you can actually, like I said, it's chess. This is chess on steroids. So you have to be able to think ahead, and you really can do that better by seeing what your opponent is doing after they deploy. You can see how they deploy. Okay, well, he's got a shield wall with his cav to the side. He's probably going to try a pincer move where he comes up protecting the cav and then smash my lines and throw the cavalry around the backside. Or he's using the cavalry as a vanguard to flank. It's one of those things where you can see it, and that's why we're not going into scenarios now, but for that scenario, personally, I like to be back a little bit so I can maybe have a turn to think about what I'm going to do and plan out a couple turns ahead. But again, that's just my thoughts. Anybody else?
If your opponent has cavalry, I've experienced this a lot. You definitely want to make sure you deploy your army so that you don't give cavalry any slack. You don't want to give them any weak spot for them to rush in and wipe you out, because they can cross the field really quickly and cut you off on some sides or even behind. And so I always like to make sure I cover the sides in my deployment, have my army together, and have that shield wall ready. Anybody else have any thoughts?
Yeah, I got one. Going back off what you guys have been saying about deploying heroes, we're not going to go into heroics too much right now. But one way to salvage a bad deployment or to gain the upper hand in deployment, especially in a scenario game like Capture and Control or Seize the Prize, one thing to think about is leaving a clear path for your army to move up, and more importantly, to move up using a heroic march, so that you can get to the objectives before your opponent. And this is going back to really looking over the battlefield, seeing where you have clear alleys to move up, and also another thing to do is look and see where, especially if you win priority for a deployment, to see what board edge looks like. It'd be a little bit more cumbersome to get across. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think I have kind of one more thing I'd like to say is we haven't talked about Maelstrom deployments. I'm gonna cover that real quick and what I think about those because that's kind of a big one. Normally at a tournament or an event, there'll be at least one Maelstrom game. The thing about those is I recommend highly. Some armies have bonuses. Some heroes give bonuses like Madril or Guritz, where you can +1 or -1 to your dice roll. I recommend that you spend the might to make sure your entire army gets on the table together. Now, sometimes, depending on who you're versing, or if you roll, a 1 or whatever, and your opponent, your warband doesn't come on, that could be good later game. But if you know that you're going to be outnumbered or whatever, I recommend that you spend the might to make sure your army is deployed. Thoughts?
I gotta agree with you on that. Every time my army's been outnumbered, it's normally not been good. It doesn't matter what I have on the field. If I don't have the models and dice to back up my side, it doesn't go well at all.
Yeah, I have to agree too. I think it's worth spending the might in Maelstrom to ensure your army is in a good position for the rest of the game. You gotta think might's probably about 10 points. A point of might is about 10 points, so it's worth the 10 points to be in a good position, I think. Thoughts?
Yeah, since we're going with Maelstrom, I'll throw in my personal opinion. I like to do my leader first, personally, just so I can see where he's going to be on the table, and then you can do your supporting heroes and supporting warbands, because you know where your hero is going to be. Your leader, we'll go with that. Sorry, that's what I meant. You go with your leader, then you're willing to spend a point or two of might here or there with your other warband leaders. That way that you bubble wrap it is the simple term to say. That way you can protect them. Uh, so one thing I'd also like to jump on real quick if I have a moment is we haven't talked about this in notice, but the side of the board you pick can actually be really, really important. It's probably almost just as important as deploying. Um, when you come to a table, you're going to pick a side. Uh, just because you guys naturally flow to that side, when it comes to priority for who rolls, if your opponent is on the better side of the table for your deployment based off of your army, don't be afraid to be like, sorry guys, I'm going to come deploy over there because that makes more sense for me tactically. And I've done it a number of times, and I'm sure everybody else here has as well. You're not being, for lack of a better word, a jerk to say, hey man, I need you to pick all your stuff up and switch sides with me. You go to have fun, but especially at tournaments, you want to win. You don't want to walk on the table and get your butt kicked, but you don't want to. You're trying to win the game, but you also got to do it so that it's best for your army. So the side you deploy on is really important. And for I think most of these scenarios, other than hold ground, which is the Maelstrom one that we just talked about, you have to pick a side. So don't be afraid to be like, yeah, I'm coming over to that side to deploy because that's the side that's going to work best for my army. Don't be afraid to do that. That's actually probably just as important as anything else when it comes to deployment. Anyone else got any thoughts on that?
For Maelstrom, for me, I actually like to kind of set a trap. Here recently with my Iron Hills, I take the ballista, and everybody really loves to just go for the ballista and take it out as quickly as they can, if they can. And Maelstrom is a really good opportunity for them to do that, especially if they happen to deploy right next to it. So I tend to actually deploy that as bait in first. So maybe they'll get something and they'll deploy something next to it, and then I'll deploy something really hard hitting right next to theirs, and that's been beneficial to me in the past, where I've been able to knock out a good portion of their army before anything else can get to me. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with both Jason's point about the board edge, like picking the best side for you. It's important, guys. You got to pick. You got to look at the board you're playing on. You got to look at your army and your opponent's army and see what side is best for you. And I was actually literally about to say the same thing about Maelstrom. Sometimes I like to have a little carrot I throw out there and see if anybody takes a bite, and if they deploy, like, okay, it looks like an easy warband to kill, or maybe even your smallest warband, you could deploy that first and see if what people are going to do to try and get us easy way to kill. I think a lot of people lose sight on that certain scenario. In the deployment phase, they lose sight of the actual objective of that game, and so they're like going for kills rather than going for the objective. So I like to take my smallest warband and put a carrot out there and see if they take the bait, and if they do, then I start to deploy the rest of my army around their warband and trap them in deployment before the game even starts. Thoughts?
I think my final word of advice for this is always have a plan B. Always be generating new plan Bs, plan Cs, and plan Ds as the game continues, as the deployment continues to play out, and be ever watchful for what could happen with what's currently being played. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with you, Sam. I don't know if we have a lot of military buffs or anything on here, but I'm a veteran, and the greatest plan is only the greatest plan on paper. It all is thrown in the trash as soon as the swords start clashing. So just be fluid, be ready to make adjustments on the fly. You're gonna have to, and you'll do fine. Like I said, I personally think that it's a chess game, and deployment is step one, but you're not gonna lose it if you have a bad deployment. You just adjust, adapt, and overcome, and go from there. Thoughts?
I think everything that I kind of think and the way I play has been said. I think that putting a carrot out there for your opponent's actually a real good tactic. I've used it before with my little micro warbands I take with my Rohan or Hobbits even. Someone like Fatty Bulger, Lobelia Baggins, who's like a one-drop hero. But that's basically it for me. I think you guys covered it pretty well. Thoughts?
Guys, we will be adding both Derek and Rainier's thoughts at the end here. So I'm not ending it early, but continue on until the end of the video. Both of them were not able to make it to recording today, but they will have their thoughts coming up here. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment below. Support your Middle-earth hobby. And stay tuned for this episode to hear their thoughts. And stay tuned for the next episode of Battle Class Season 1. We will be going into the movement phase in the next video. Take care.
Hey guys, this is Rainier tuning in for today's episode on deployment. A lot of what I have to say today kind of piggybacks on what previous players have talked about on how deployment is very essential to the game. Deployment kind of sets the pace. Deployment is a reactionary, I guess, part of the game, and so forth. I kind of liked what Jason said. That one phrase kind of sticks out with me, is like, the game is kind of like chess on steroids. And I would agree totally with that, to where every slight move counts, and every little microaggression that you use with your warbands count as well. So deployment is very much like that. It sets the tone of the game. You can very much time see like how experienced someone is by how they deploy, whether or not they split their forces up, which I would highly recommend not to if you're just learning how to play the game. Never deploy your warbands away from each other, because an experienced player will take advantage of that and kind of gang up on you. Kind of like like when you have animals and they stay in their herds, and like a portion of them like go out by themselves, and usually the predators go and they attack the weak link. Deployment with warbands is kind of like that. If you're a new player, you don't want to have a warband out in the middle of nowhere and then like have the rest of your army in a separate place, because an experienced player will like take advantage of that and gang up on your small force. So don't make the rookie mistake of splitting your army. That's my advice number one to new players. My second advice, I guess, just based on experience with playing the game, is treat deployment like a how do I phrase this? Treat it like it's a system of reaction. So have your warbands ready. Place your weak one first, if you're placing first, and then see where your opponent places theirs, and then react with your warband. Kind of let them set the tone in that aspect, and you kind of react to it and put your warbands where they're needed. A lot of times when you play the game, you can kind of see how your opponent, if you're in the tournament scene, you can see how your opponent plays just based off the way he or she deploys. So if you see your opponent kind of deploying non-aggressively and stuff, you can kind of like, right out of the batting cage, you can kind of see that they're not such an aggressive player, and you can exploit that by deploying more aggressively and pushing them off their chair in a way, and off their balance. Or say if they deploy extremely aggressively, you could see that, and you could either match that with your aggressive deployment if you have a better army, or you could counter that with deploying non-aggressively and trying to take out a couple of the opponent's forces before with shooting before like fighting actually commences. So deployment, just to paraphrase what I've been thinking, is deployment is just reaction. You always want to react to what your opponent's doing. You always want to force them to make decisions to react, and that's why Maelstrom comes into play a lot. And Maelstrom, a lot of people don't like Maelstrom scenarios because it's just chaos. The one thing about Maelstrom, if you're a good player, you just gotta react to what your opponent's doing. Even if you place first, you can have a couple like warbands in reserve, use might if you want, and react to where they're at and kind of fill the holes. It kind of goes back to that whole Roman legionnaire motto, where if there's a hole that's in, like, just have a soldier fill it, just fill the hole and know where your weaknesses are and fix them. Or if there's a hole in their force, metaphorically, in their deployment, exploit it and whatnot. But yeah, that's probably my biggest advice. Yeah, to a new player, is don't split your army and react and treat deployment like a reactionary system, and exploit your opponent's weaknesses. Read how they play the game, read their personality in a way, whether they're aggressive or not aggressive, and just exploit it and have fun with it. Sometimes people, in my opinion, take deployment too seriously, which is, you need to take it very seriously because it dictates the games in many instances. But sometimes when you take it too seriously, it gets in your head and you start treating it like a number game, to where everything has to be perfect. Whereas, in my opinion, just react to the situation how it comes up. Have a plan in place, but expect it to fail, and just react to whatever happens by exploiting your opponent and filling your holes and your weaknesses. But I guess, yeah, that's all I have to say for today about my whole views on deployment and the importance of it. Alright guys, well, I'll talk to you, I guess, next episode. Have a nice one.